I'm not a trained economist or anything, but we often talk about the virtues of capitalism versus other systems, and socialism is so often used as a criticism. You're a socialist or you're a communist, and you are someone who unabashedly, proudly is a socialist. So I'm curious to you, what does that mean in the way that you use it? How does that, what sort of policies and ways of approaching the world fall under that term?
Yeah. So for me, socialism is all about economic democracy, functionally. Back during the Enlightenment times, when the primary means of sort of like civilizational economic organization was mercantilism, generally speaking, when corporations wanted to move around, they did so with the implicit permission of the state. And laissez-faire capitalism, Adam Smith, the ye olden days, the basic premise was, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we all had the freedom to achieve great independent economic prosperity? And to an extent, that's what capitalism affords us. But the criticism, and this is a criticism that I agree with, is that giving individuals the freedom to rule over others is not actually a system which begets freedom. That capitalism, while it does afford anybody the ability to get big, cannot afford everybody the ability to get big. And therefore, I would say to advocates of capitalism the same thing that I would say to advocates of feudalism, which is it's all well and good that some people get all that power, and sometimes merit may even be involved. But would it not be better if we all had the opportunity to collectively take from what we produce a piece of the pie? And that's what I advocate for, economic democracy. Everybody who works at a given firm collectively owns that firm. It's essentially a worker co-op. And if you distribute that process across a whole civilization, I mean, you've got essentially the economic backbone of socialism, and a lot of people, when they think socialism, they think Stalin, they think tanks rolling down Main Street. And that's a very unfortunate association, because I think, if anything, socialism done properly is the least coercive possible economic system.
And so when you say it's distributed ownership and it's democratic, does that mean completely equally distributed? Like, does this mean everybody has to have some equity in the company, or this means that the founder and the janitor and everyone in between would have the same vote and the same amount of the economics?
What you're describing is called a flat cooperative, which I don't think are sustainable past a certain size. We have to accept the fact different types of labor produce different types of results. And I do think it's okay for there to be some kind of tiered distribution. Many existing co-ops have such a thing. Usually flat co-ops are for very small firms. Have either of you played Dead Cells, the video game?
I've not.
No.
Brilliant video game. Anyway, I think 11, 12 people worked in it. Flat co-op, guy who's hired day one and guy who's hired 4 years down the line, same wage. Incredible work. Doesn't work for every industry. I think it's not so much about compensation as it is the internal democratic process. Managers aren't chosen, they're elected. And executive decisions are made through a bottom-up process where everybody gets at least some input on what's being done with their labor.
Got it. And so I understand the compensation perspective. Once leaders are democratically elected, do they then have more votes as well? Which is to say, like, let's say we're making a decision, we're a 50-person company, but it's not necessarily that 50 people put a vote into a hat. It's that whoever's elected as president might have 10 votes to cast, whereas whoever is the lowest level would only have one vote, but they still have a vote.
I think that it would be up to the people on the ground, the people doing the initial vote, the managerial vote, to decide what tasks the manager should be responsible for. There are some things I think everybody should get a decision on, like very large, where are we moving this firm? What big decisions are we making? But then there are things that I think, like, kept at a managerial level, it's probably best, like scheduling decisions, for example. If everyone had to vote on that, it would be chaos every single week. So I think it would be up to them. And there are many, many, many different ways that this could function. I just think that introducing that baseline expectation of democracy would be really good. And there's data on the effectiveness of co-ops as well. And it seems that, if you look at them across the board, there's like a lot of really positive stuff about like worker happiness and productivity. And it seems like much with our liberal democracies, that we live in politically, there are advantages in terms of happiness and productivity associated with everybody feeling like they're a participant in the society they live in.
Sure. I'm literally just trying to understand how the rules work. Cause I know this is not what every socialist would identify as their definition of socialism. So socialism to you, it's not so much governmental as it is about corporate America. It doesn't reflect like a lack of having a president. It's that companies are democratic as well. And someone could still have 50 times as much ownership in a company if they're the CEO and the founder relative to the lowest level person, but everybody gets a vote on the major things, and everybody owns some percentage of the company, even though it might be this guy owns 1%, this guy owns 30%. Am I roughly understanding correctly?
Oh, yeah. Now, for me personally, because of my political leanings, I would prefer the flattest possible hierarchy that could function in any given society. That means democratically with how our elections function. That means in firms with how they do their, how they manage things. And it's really just a matter of how effective they could be at any given level of flatness, basically. If every American citizen, all 180 million eligible voters, had to individually vote on every single policy to come out of Congress, like direct voting on every single thing, I don't know how well that would work. So we have tiered systems of representation. We live in a republic. And I think that struggling to find that balance should be the dominant economic question today. Nowadays, we argue about whether or not letting immigrants in or raising the minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 an hour would be like devastating to our economy. These are asinine questions to me. To me, I want us to be asking, how can we best realize the American dream in how our economy is structured?
So when it comes to democracy, I was thinking a lot about this at the beginning of COVID, because I was, are there limitations to the general value of democracy? If everybody votes that we need to burn down the 5G towers and not wear masks, are these outcomes that we want to have? And I think of the same thing within sort of a corporate environment or any sort of familial environment. So do you see competing forces with the expansion of democracy that you would need to have in place? For instance, that you also need to have some sort of baseline business education, that there would be things that would need to qualify one for that? Or is it just, if you are old enough and work in a place, you deserve the right to vote in its future and how it conducts its business?
I think it's about priming the average citizen to expect to participate in these systems, because that was an argument made against democracy originally, way back in the day, that the average peasantry, because back then they were illiterate, they were, quite ignorant, 16th century European peasants. And the argument was made, these people can't govern themselves. And to an extent, that's true. One of the big arguments for public education is that every citizen needs to be at a baseline level of education for them to be even able to function in a democracy. And I agree with that. And I think that applies to worker ownership as well. I think that if we foster that expectation, and then along with getting trained for the job you do, you're also getting trained for the democratic structure of the workplace you're entering, which I don't think would be that hard to do. I think you prime people to be more capable of managing those responsibilities.
Well, I also think the only problem with what you're describing is if you don't localize it, and then if people can basically fuck shit up and then go somewhere else to escape. But let's say that it was just towns were deciding what caused COVID, and a town was like, I think it's 5G towers, and so they burned down all their 5G towers and they refused to wear masks. It's like, okay, you're just not allowed to leave your town now. If this doesn't work and you all get COVID and you miss having 5G because we're all downloading stuff really fast and you're not, just live with the consequences. But the problem comes when you have people who are getting famous on YouTube for saying that that's the case, getting all the money.
Yeah, no skin in the game.
But then they still have 5G on their phone and they won't let anyone talk to them unless they're wearing masks. You know what I'm saying? But if there was a town that, I'm fine with this, that was just that we're really, really positive this isn't a virus and this is how we're going to handle it. My only thing would be, please don't leave your town. Just deal with the consequences of your decision.
So this isn't a criticism. Well, I guess it is a criticism of democracy, but you have the same problem in any sort of authoritative structure, which is that the majority can be wrong, right? The majority can make bad things, and I'm assuming,
and often are,
yes,
as a matter of fact.
And I'm assuming that your perspective is, so can a singular technocrat, and at least we're better off with the majority of people signing their own death warrant or making whatever poor decision.
We have that problem with American democracy today, where a lot of the decision making that comes out of the top seems like it's geared towards the interests of a small group of plutocrats, bankers, investors, and business moguls. And what we're arguing about fundamentally is material conditions. What are people incentivized to do when they have the power to influence change? And certainly there are problems with democracy. Democracy does not instantly mean freedom. America was ostensibly a democracy back in the 1950s. We did very bad things with our ability to democratically decide, for example, what racial policies we should implement. Of course, it wasn't a perfect democracy, but you can do bad things in a democracy. But generally speaking, with the right preconditions, I would trust a democracy to an autocracy. basically any day of the week. And the good thing about corporations too, and this is unique, by the way, to worker co-ops, you don't see this in a country, is that since a firm's ultimate driven purpose is to produce a profit, as it would be in any cooperatively owned system as well, unless we're talking about decommodification, but that's a whole other thing. If there are bad decisions being made by members of a firm, those consequences are felt. If you're doing a bad job running a business, everybody makes less money because all of you take cuts from the total profits. Whereas in a country, countries are large enough that you can make bad decisions and those outcomes can only be felt by a small portion, say the poor or a given racial minority or foreigners. The externalities of a firm are reduced compared to the externalities of a country. And I think that might be a better argument for democracy being implemented there.
Got it.
And do you think this has to be pushed from the top? Because my questioning is, if it's a superior way to run a business, right? If a democratic business has happier employees, people are getting paid more, so it attracts the most talent. Now you're like making the most money. You're gonna ultimately be the best company. So does the government need to tell people to do this, or within the realm of capitalism, won't Darwinism just make co-ops win in the long run if it's the best way to run a business?
Depends on your goals, right? I think democratic societies tend to function better than autocratic ones. But if you just let a bunch of different tribes, let's say societies, loose on the plains of Europe, and you give them some time with no external overriding rules about what you're allowed to do to others, inevitably the warlords and autocrats are going to win because they don't have to play by the same rules. And what you find is with worker cooperatives, even if there is like a really productive and happy internal structure, it's that these systems don't function that well when other more autocratic firms work together to maintain a system of economics that benefits them. If you're a CEO or a stockholder, you don't want systems like this taking root in how our country functions. That's antithetical to your goals. So you will lobby as best as you can. You will try to form monopolies, or at the very least, like very tight market strangleholds to prevent entryism into the market. There are actually, if you look back on it, there have been attempts to democratize a ton of I wish I could remember the specific names of these corporations, but like ISPs, for example, or utility companies, or sometimes even like tech startups that are more, I guess you would say, democratic, but they tend to get shut down more aggressively or bought out because it sets a bad precedent in those markets. You can also look at the laws for banks and their loan rates to cooperative markets. They're much, much lower than what you would get from a traditionally owned firm. So there are a lot of these institutional barriers, some of which are malicious in nature, and a lot of which are just people being ignorant of this being a system that can work. I guess the big step now is about normalizing it. And if a time ever comes where legislation could be introduced to this effect, personally, I think the way our economy functions now is really unethical. We may live in a democratic society, but the whims of one's life for most workers are driven day to day by a system they have no control over. Mm-hmm. If they're a worker in a plant or a retail worker or whatever, they have no control over that system. And I think that leads to some really bad outcomes. What I want long term, and I know I'm rambling, I'm sorry,
you're
is good. If this could be like OSHA, this could be like worker health and safety, There's a government branch. People don't talk about it that much. It just does what it does. And it just mandates some baseline level of democratic participation in firms above a given size, not mom and pop businesses, not two people doing a startup. But if you're a large corporation, just a set of baseline principles, you get to vote on that, everybody gets some slice of the pie. I think a step like that would be really, really great. But we have to normalize it, and we have to make people happy with those changes first. So not like some tyrannical top-down takeover or anything like that.
Got it. So hope that you guys enjoyed that clip. If you want to see more like this and have us do more podcasts, we are 100% funded by our generous patrons. And if you'd like to contribute, there's a link in the description, and we'll have one pop up on the screen right here so that we can do more podcasts where we have fun conversations and hopefully some deep ones like this. Either way, hope that you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.